Imagine you are playing a deadly game of chess.
Right.
But here is the catch. The board is constantly pitching and rolling. It is pitch black. The freezing waves of the North Atlantic are just, tossing your pieces around.
Sounds absolutely miserable.
Oh, it gets worse. The rules of the game change every single time you make a move. You don't know if the piece you're moving is going to strike the enemy or if, like, a sudden rule change just turned it into a target.
Yeah, that is a terrifying scenario.
It is, and that is exactly the environment we are plunging into today. We are looking at the ultimate lesson in why adapting to your environment isn't just, some corporate buzzword. It is literally a matter of life and death.
Absolutely.
So today's deep dive is an exploration of one of the most intense, high-stakes games of cat and mouse in military history, the U-boat war in the Atlantic during World War II.
It really is a staggering piece of history to unpack. I mean, we are going to trace the brutal evolution of submarine tactics today. We will look at how grand strategy, bleeding-edge technology, and honestly, sheer human nerve collided in the middle of a freezing ocean. We're looking at how an elite fighting force had to constantly morph its methods.
Like total reinvention, right?
Exactly. Starting out as lone wolf snipers,
Mm-hmm.
then shifting into massive ocean-spanning wolf packs, and finally resorting to these wild, desperate technological gambles just to keep their heads above water, literally and figuratively.
I love that. And for you listening, to guide us through this, our entire deep dive today is based on this fantastic historical guide called U-Boat Tactics in World War II by Gordon Williamson.
It is such a good source.
A total goldmine. It breaks down the doctrines, the incredible machines, and the men who fought beneath the waves. So to orient ourselves, let's look at the massive timeline of this conflict, because it isn't just one long, uniform battle, right?
No, not at all.
There are distinct eras, starting with what the German commanders famously called the Happy Times.
Yeah, the timeline is basically a massive pendulum swing. The first happy time was roughly 1940 into 1941. They were operating out of these newly captured French ports.
Right on the Atlantic coast.
Exactly. Then there was a second happy time in 1942, which specifically targeted the eastern coast of the United States.
Yeah.
During these windows, the U-boats were, practically untouchable and devastatingly effective.
But the pendulum swings back, right?
Violently. It violently swings back around May 1943. That is the definitive turning point where the hunters permanently became the hunted.
Okay, I want to pause on the sheer scale of this.
Yeah.
Because the numbers in Williamson's book are just mind-bending. Between 1935 and 1945, over 1,700 U-boats were commissioned.
Wow.
Right. Of those, about 920 actually sailed on active war patrols. And here is the brutal reality for the listener. Around 800 of those boats were sunk.
Yeah.
That is an almost unfathomable casualty rate for a modern military branch. It's near total annihilation.
It really is. The U-boat fleet suffered the highest casualty rate of any service branch in the German armed forces.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
But, the most striking anomaly in the data isn't the total losses. It is the massive disparity in performance.
What do you mean?
Well, look at this statistic. Roughly 75% of the U-boat fleet that went to sea never damaged a single Allied ship.
Wait, 75%?
Yep. 3/4 of them achieved absolutely nothing before they were destroyed or the war ended.
Okay, let's just process that. That is the Pareto principle on absolute steroids. You've got this tiny fraction of commanders doing almost all the damage.
Oh, it gets crazier. The book notes that just 320 boats sank around 2,840 ships.
Wow.
That's 14.3 million tons of shipping. And if we look at the top 32 ace commanders, they represent about 2% of the total captains, right?
2%?
Yet they accounted for nearly 30% of all Allied shipping losses.
My immediate question is why? Why are 3/4 of these crews sailing out into the Atlantic and just failing completely? Were they just patrolling empty patches of ocean? Or was the skill gap actually that profound?
The skill gap was an absolute chasm. Success in the brutal environment of the Atlantic wasn't really about the submarine itself.
Because they were all using roughly the same equipment.
Exactly. The Type C U-boat was the workhorse for almost everyone. The determining factor was entirely the commander.
So it came down to the individual.
100%. Those top 32 aces, the ones doing the lion's share of the sinking, they were almost universally older, pre-war captains. By 1939, their average age was about 28.
Which sounds young to us today.
It does, but in military terms, they had nearly a decade of continuous sea service behind them. They trained in peacetime. They had the deep, ingrained muscle memory necessary to handle highly complex machinery in terrifying, high-stress environments.
So they didn't have to think about the mechanics of the boat. It was like an extension of their bodies. They could focus entirely on the tactical environment outside the hull.
Exactly that. Once those veteran commanders were gone, either killed in action or promoted to desk jobs by 1942 or 1943, the Kriegsmarine faced a massive crisis.
Because they had to replace them.
Right. They had to rapidly expand the fleet, which meant relying on hastily trained crews led by completely inexperienced officers.
Just pushing them through the pipeline.
Yeah, the training time was heavily compressed, and you cannot replicate a decade of sea sense in a 6-month crash course.
No, of course not.
These newer crews were basically thrown into the deep end against an Allied anti-submarine warfare machine that was getting vastly more sophisticated every single month. They simply lacked the intuition to survive.
Man. So to really understand how that elite 2% achieved their terrifying success, we have to look at the specific methods they invented.
Yes.
And to do that, we have to talk about a tactic that, on paper, sounds like complete madness. Let's look at the silent auto method.
The night surface attack.
Yeah.
This was the defining tactic pioneered by the most successful U-boat ace of the entire war, Korvettenkapitän Otto Kretschmer.
He commanded U-99, right?
He did, and he personally sank over 263,000 tons of Allied shipping.
That is just an insane amount of metal to put at the bottom of the ocean.
It really is. He earned the nickname Silent Otto because he was notoriously reluctant to use his radio.
Smart guy.
Very. He understood early on the broadcasting signals meant the British could track him. But his true signature move, the one that made him a legend, was attacking heavily defended convoys at night, entirely on the surface.
And this is where my brain just hits a brick wall.
Why is that?
Remaining on the surface seems incredibly counterintuitive. I mean, you are in a submarine. The entire evolutionary advantage of your vessel is its ability to hide underwater.
Right.
If you are spotted on the surface, you are a tin can balanced on a tightrope. It takes, 25 to 30 agonizing seconds to open the vents and crash dive?
Roughly, yeah.
So if a single explosive shell from an escort destroyer hits that main pressure hull before you get under, you lose the ability to dive, which means you are dead.
Oh.
Math over fear. Okay.
Exactly. It comes down to speed and the limits of 1940s technology. A surfaced Type Ceph U-boat, running on its powerful diesel engines, could hit a top speed of about 17 knots.
Which is pretty fast for the ocean.
It was significantly faster than the lumbering merchant convoys. They often struggled to maintain 8 or 9 knots, and critically, it was faster than many of the smaller Allied escort corvettes protecting them.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, they are treating the submarine like a high-speed torpedo boat.
Exactly.
They can literally outrun the danger. But if they submerge to hide, what happens to their speed?
Oh, it plummets. If they dive, they had to shut off the air-breathing diesel engines and switch to their battery-powered electric motors.
Because you can't run diesels underwater.
Right, you'd suffocate the crew. So suddenly, their top speed drops to just 7.3 knots, and they can only maintain that for a short burst before the batteries drain completely. They become sluggish and very easily outmaneuvered.
Wow. Okay, but speed alone doesn't protect you from being seen.
No, but the darkness does. And this ties into the second massive advantage. They were neutralizing the enemy's primary trapping technology.
How so?
Well, the Allied sonar at the time was called ASDIC. It was an active acoustic location system.
Like a ping.
Exactly like a ping. The escort ship would send a pulse of sound down into the water. If that sound wave hit the solid steel hull of a submerged submarine, it bounced back, giving the escort the bearing and range.
Like echolocation.
Yes. But ASDIC was totally useless against a surface vessel. The sound waves traveled through the water beneath the U-boat's shallow draft. To the ASDIC operators listening below the surface, Kretschmer's boat simply didn't exist.
That is a phenomenal detail. They are exploiting a physical blind spot in the sound waves, so they're faster than the escorts and effectively invisible to the underwater sensors.
Invisible.
Walk me through what this looks like for the listener. Put us in Kretschmer's boots. How does he actually execute this?
Okay, imagine you are Kretschmer. During the daylight hours, you spot the smoke of a convoy on the horizon. You stay submerged, keeping your distance, moving parallel to get ahead of them. You wait for the sun to go down. The ocean turns pitch black. Then you surface the boat.
Okay, I'm with you.
You are standing on the open bridge of the conning tower. The cold Atlantic wind is whipping past you. The deafening roar of your own diesel engines is vibrating up through your boots.
Sounds intense.
You find a gap between the escort warships patrolling the perimeter. And then instead of firing from the outside, you order full speed ahead. You literally sprint right through the defensive screen and into the chaotic, overlapping columns of the merchant ships.
He is basically using the convoy's own physical mass as a cloak.
Yes,
He's hiding in plain sight. And the source details how beautifully this worked in August 1940. He stalks convoy OB-191. He waits for the escorts to speed off into the dark, chasing a false
a
contact.
total diversion.
Yeah. As soon as there is a gap, he slips inside the convoy perimeter. He is trimmed so low in the water that the deck of the submarine is practically awash with the waves. He sinks the massive tanker Strinda from just 600 meters away.
Point-blank range.
Then he maneuvers and hits the Lucerna from 500 meters. Then he pivots and hits the Alexia. It's this synchronized demolition of isolated targets.
And the merchant ships have no idea what is happening.
None. They are firing flares, sounding their sirens, and they actually end up colliding with each other in the dark, trying to avoid this invisible menace that is just weaving between them.
It induced pure terror and total chaos.
Mm-hmm.
The defenders were structurally unprepared for an enemy fighting from within the herd.
The wolf is inside the fence.
Exactly. And Kretschmer repeated this masterpiece the very next month, in September 1940, against convoy HX-72.
What happened there?
He slipped in on the surface, torpedoed the Invershannon, then the Baron Blythswood, then the Elm Banks.
Unbelievable.
And the Allied escorts were racing around the outer perimeter of the convoy, dropping depth charges into the water, frantically pinging their ASDIC, searching for a submerged enemy.
While he's just sitting on top of the water.
Meanwhile, Kretschmer is sitting on the surface right in the middle of the merchant ships. He felt so secure in this chaotic blind spot that he actually kept his crew on the exposed deck to reload the torpedo tubes.
We need to underline how audacious that is. Reloading those external torpedoes wasn't just, pushing a button.
Oh, no. It was a massive physical undertaking.
These were massive 2-ton steel cylinders stored under the wooden floor grates of the upper deck. The crew had to rig up a block and tackle, manually hoist this massive weapon in the freezing wind, and angle it down a narrow hatch into the submarine.
It was an exhausting, highly complex process that took a long time.
And crucially, you cannot crash dive while the loading hatch is open.
Nope.
If an escort stumbled upon them, the U-boat would be entirely defenseless. They'd just flood and sink. He just sat there in the dark, performing heavy industrial labor on the deck, while the escorts lost their minds a few nails away.
It required a psychological baseline of absolute ice in his veins. And Kretschmer's tactical brilliance wasn't just kept to himself. He eventually wrote a comprehensive report summarizing his methods.
Oh, so he documented it.
He did. This document was so effective that it became the foundational basis for the official doctrine in the 1943 U-Boat Commander's Handbook.
That's fascinating.
The handbook laid out very specific, calculated rules for the listener to imagine. You always attack at night. You approach from the dark side of the convoy, meaning you want the target ship silhouetted against the ambient glow of the moonlight, while your low-profile submarine remains hidden in the darker shadows of the horizon.
And the handbook says if there is no moon, you attack from the windward side. Why the windward side?
It is all about visual signature.
Okay.
If a submarine is motoring fast into the wind suppresses the spray, and the boat doesn't throw up a highly visible, glowing white bow wave.
Wait, glowing?
Yeah, water in the Atlantic is often phosphorescent due to plankton. A churning bow wave literally glows in the dark.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think of that.
By attacking from the windward side, the commander minimizes that glowing footprint. The doctrine also stressed immense discipline, firing at incredibly close range, and the golden rule was 1 torpedo, 1 ship.
Right, because torpedoes were the most precious commodity on the boat. A standard Type C U-boat only carried a maximum of 14 torpedoes.
That's it.
You don't fire a fan of 3 or 4 torpedoes hoping one hits. You have to trust your aim.
Precisely. You get to point-blank range, you fire 1 shot, and you guarantee a kill.
So they are fiercely protecting their limited ammunition. But that brings us to a really interesting problem.
What's that?
What does a U-boat commander do when they stumble across a small, lone, unarmed freighter? It's an enemy ship, it needs to be sunk, but it isn't worth a massive, highly engineered torpedo.
Right, it's not a high-value target.
Exactly. The answer is they get up close and personal. This introduces the era of the deck gun attacks.
The deck gun was such a vital tool in the early war. Most U-boats were equipped with either an 8.8 centimeter or a massive 10.5 centimeter artillery piece mounted right on the forward deck.
Like a tank barrel, basically.
Yes. And the statistics are really surprising. In September 1939, right at the start of the conflict, roughly 25% of the overall tonnage sunk by U-boats was destroyed by gunfire, not by torpedoes.
Wow. And conserving ammo was a huge factor, but there was a much darker, more frustrating reason they relied on the guns.
The torpedo crisis.
Yes. The early German torpedoes were practically sabotaging their own war effort. The source details the torpedo crisis during the Norwegian campaign in the spring of 1940. The German detonators, specifically the G7 magnetic influence detonators, were disastrously flawed.
The torpedo crisis is a fascinating study in technological failure. The detonators were designed to sense the magnetic field of a ship's hull and explode directly underneath the keel.
To break the ship's back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the engineers hadn't accounted for the natural fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field at high northern latitudes, like near Norway.
Oh, that's wild. The geography messed up the sensors.
It completely threw them off. During the campaign, more than 30 out of 42 attacks on Allied warships completely failed.
Imagine the psychological toll of that. You stalk a British battleship, you risk your life to get into position, you fire a perfect shot, and then you just listen through the hydrophones.
And you hear nothing.
Or worse, you literally hear the torpedo hit the enemy hull with a dull metallic clunk, and nothing happens. It just sinks. Or it explodes prematurely halfway to the target, alerting the entire enemy fleet to your exact position.
Both happen frequently.
If you know your torpedoes are faulty, and you only have 14 of them to begin with, you are definitely going to lean heavily on your artillery.
Exactly. If they found a smaller, less valuable target traveling alone, they surfaced and used the gun. But the methodology behind these early gun attacks is almost surreal to modern ears.
How so?
It was heavily dictated by the Prize Ordnance Regulations of 1936.
What were those?
This was an international treaty designed to civilize naval warfare.
Civilized warfare? That sounds like an oxymoron.
It really does. Under these incredibly strict rules, unless a merchant vessel was actively escorted by warships or aircraft, the submarine commander was legally responsible for ensuring the absolute safety of the merchant crew before destroying their ship.
It's like something out of the 18th century. They aren't assassins yet, they are heavily armed customs inspectors.
That's a great way to put it.
Walk us through how a prize regulation attack actually played out.
Okay, so a U-boat would spot a lone freighter. They would surface a few miles astern of it and physically run up a signal flag, ordering the ship to heave to.
Pull over.
Pull over. If the ship didn't immediately stop, the U-boat's gun crew would fire a warning shot across the bow, literally splashing a shell in the water ahead of the ship.
Okay.
Once the freighter stopped its engines, the U-boat didn't just blast it. They would order the merchant crew to lower a lifeboat and row over to the submarine.
Bring me your papers.
Exactly. Bringing their ship's manifests and cargo papers. The German commander would stand on the deck, review the paperwork, and determine if the cargo was contraband or war material.
And if it was...
If it was, the U-boat would order the merchant crew to stay in their lifeboats, and only then would the U-boat sink the empty freighter.
That is just, it's crazy. And the historical record shows they could be shockingly polite, almost chivalrous about the whole process.
There's some wild stories.
There is a famous account of Günther Prien in U-47. In June 1940, he pulls over a tanker called the Letitia. He shells it to a halt. The crew frantically abandons ship, but in the chaos, 3 sailors get left behind.
Oh, no.
They end up jumping into the freezing water as the ship goes down. Now, Prien doesn't just sail away. He maneuvers his submarine, literally fishes these 3 freezing men out of the ocean, brings them aboard, gives them dry clothing, hot food, and a bottle of wine.
The bottle of wine.
Yes, and then he safely transfers them to the lifeboats with the rest of their crew before departing.
It is a bizarre juxtaposition of humanity and destruction. And Otto Kretschmer had a similarly surreal encounter.
What did he do?
He stopped a small freighter called the Marisar with a warning shot in July 1940. The crew is terrified and immediately abandoned ship into their lifeboats. But Kretschmer was actually annoyed by this.
Annoyed?
Yeah, he didn't want to waste ammunition sinking it. So he ordered the merchant sailors to row back, climb aboard their ship, and he literally instructed them to sail their own ship to German-occupied Bordeaux as a prize of war.
You're kidding! He told them to deliver themselves.
Yes, he bluffed them, claiming he would remain submerged and shadow them the entire way, and if they deviated from the course, he would sink them without warning.
And they actually did it. They sailed a prize ship for the enemy.
They did.
Though in a tragic twist of wartime miscommunication, the Luftwaffe stumbled upon the Marisar a few days later and accidentally bombed it before it could reach the port.
War is chaotic.
Truly. But this whole era of gentlemen inspectors feels incredibly fragile. It couldn't possibly survive the reality of total war.
No, the environment was already adapting to counter them. The Allies quickly realized that complying with the prize regulations was just an elegant way of committing economic suicide.
Right, you can't just hand over your ships.
They couldn't let their merchant fleet be sitting targets, so they changed the rules.
Yep.
The British Admiralty began secretly arming their merchant vessels with defensive deck guns mounted on the stern. And even more deceptively, they introduced Q-ships.
Explain a Q ship for the listener, because this is where the paranoia really sets in for a submarine crew.
A Q-ship was a wolf in sheep's clothing. It was designed to look exactly like a dilapidated, harmless, innocent tramp steamer, just a rusted old cargo ship.
Okay.
But hidden behind collapsible bulkheads and fake lifeboats were heavy naval artillery pieces and anti-tank guns.
Wow.
The strategy was to purposefully loiter in U-boat-infested waters, acting as bait. When a U-boat surfaced to fire a warning shot and check papers, the Q-ship crew would panic, maybe even lower a fake panic party in a lifeboat to really sell the illusion. Yeah. They would wait until the U-boat drifted in close on the surface, totally exposed. Then they would drop the fake canvas walls, revealing the heavy artillery, and unleash a devastating point-blank broadside into the fragile submarine.
Imagine the absolute terror of being on that U-boat gun crew. You are standing on a narrow, wet, pitching steel deck. You are completely exposed to the elements. You are holding an artillery shell, looking at a rusted cargo ship, and suddenly the walls of that ship fall away to reveal a battery of heavy machine guns and cannons.
It was a death sentence for a surface submarine. The U-boat bridge crew had to maintain a state of frantic, terrified vigilance.
Because anything could be a trap.
Exactly. If an Allied plane suddenly dropped out of the clouds or the harmless ship opened fire, the gun crew had to scramble.
And they can't just jump down the hatch.
No, they had to unload the weapon, unbolt the watertight tampions to plug the gun barrel, physically carry the heavy ready-use ammunition back across the slippery deck, and funnel 5 or 6 men down a tiny shoulder-width hatch before the commander could even begin the 30-second process of crash diving.
It simply took too long.
Too long. The environment changed, and the tactic became obsolete.
The source notes that as Allied anti-submarine warfare improved, and specifically as radar became prevalent, surfacing during the day to play artillery duels became suicidal.
Right.
By mid-1943, the Kriegsmarine actually gave up. They started entirely removing the heavy 8.8-centimeter deck guns from the majority of the Type 7 boats.
It was just dead weight.
Exactly. The gun had gone from a primary weapon to an unnecessary source of weight and hydrodynamic drag.
It perfectly illustrates the arms race. You exploit vulnerability, the enemy plugs the hole, and you have to adapt or die. But while the deck gun vanished, the lone wolf mentality of those early days didn't entirely disappear right away. It just evolved into more strategic, long-range solo missions.
Let's follow that evolution. We are talking about missions where a single U-boat is sent out completely unsupported to hunt in a distant theater. The German Naval Command categorized these as either Einzelstellung, patrolling a strictly defined grid square, or Freijag, which translates to a free hunting license.
Find the enemy wherever they are and kill them.
Right.
These solo missions produced some of the most spectacular, psychologically devastating shocks of the early war. We already touched on Gunther Prien's chivalry, but a year prior, in October 1939, Prien was ordered to execute a solo mission that shook the British Empire to its core.
Where did he go?
He was sent to penetrate Scapa Flow.
Oh. For context for the listener, Scapa Flow isn't just a harbor. It is the massive, incredibly heavily defended Royal Navy fleet anchorage in the remote Orkney Islands of Scotland. It is ringed by anti-submarine nets, minefields, and coastal artillery.
It was considered an impenetrable fortress.
Absolutely impenetrable.
But Prien's penetration of Scapa Flow is a masterclass in extreme navigational nerve. He didn't dive under the defenses. He took U-47 through a narrow, treacherous tidal inlet called Kirk Sound on the surface at night.
That's crazy.
The British had intentionally sunk old ships, called block ships, in the channel to create a physical barrier. Prien had to thread his submarine between the rusted hulls of these sunken ships in the pitch dark.
The sensory details of this are just incredible. The tidal currents in Kirk Sound were violently unpredictable. At one point, Prien's submarine was caught in a 10-knot cross-current.
Pushing them completely off course.
Right. The water physically pushed the boat out of the channel, and the steel keel actually ground along the rocky bottom of the seabed. The crew could hear the screech of metal on rock.
Inside a submarine, that sound is terrifying.
It must have been deafening. The current shoved them so close to one of the sunken block ships that they temporarily got tangled in its anchor chain. One wrong move, or one sentry spotting them, and they are trapped in a dead-end channel with coastal artillery pointed right at them.
But he maintained control. He forced the boat through, spent half an hour cruising undetected around this massive, supposedly safe harbor, and found the British battleship HMS Royal Oak sitting at anchor.
And then?
Priyan fired a salvo of torpedoes. He waited, meticulously reloaded the tubes, which took roughly 15 minutes of agonizing tension, and fired again. The second volley triggered a massive magazine explosion. The battleship sank, taking over 800 British sailors with her. And then, with the entire harbor waking up to the catastrophe, Priyan managed to navigate U-47 all the way back out through that same treacherous swirling channel and escaped into the North Sea.
It proved that no place was truly safe. And these solo hunters didn't confine themselves to the North Atlantic. They pushed deep into the Mediterranean.
Yes, they did.
The source highlights U-81 sinking the famous British aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal in 1941, and the even more dramatic sinking of the battleship HMS Barham by U-331.
The Barham incident is a vital case study, not just because of the sinking, but because it highlights the extreme physical forces these machines and men endured.
Walk us through it.
Commander Hans-Dietrich von Tiesenhausen in U-331 managed to slip undetected through a dense screen of escort destroyers. He found himself broadside to the HMS Barham and fired a spread of 4 heavy torpedoes from a range of just 1,200 meters.
Right into the broadside.
3 of them struck the battleship. The Barham rolled over, its magazines detonated in a cataclysmic explosion, and the massive ship sank in barely 4 minutes.
But firing those torpedoes almost killed the U-boat instantly. This is a fascinating physics problem. A single G7 torpedo weighs over 3,000 pounds.
Heavy piece of machinery.
Extremely. When you fire 4 of them simultaneously, you are instantly ejecting 12,000 pounds of weight from the very tip of your submarine.
Exactly. Buoyancy is a delicate, razor-thin balance. Suddenly, losing that massive amount of weight from the bow caused U-331 to pitch violently upwards. Tiesenhausen totally lost control of the boat's trim.
The nose just popped up.
The submarine surged toward the surface, and the conning tower literally erupted out of the water directly in front of another British battleship, the HMS Valiant.
Talk about out of the frying pan.
The Valiant immediately spotted the submarine and altered course to physically ram it and crush it.
So Tiesenhausen screams for a crash dive. They flood the forward tanks to get the nose down, but they overcompensate.
They absolutely plummeted. And to make matters worse, the violent pitching had damaged their depth gauges.
Oh, is it bad?
The standard Type 7 U-boat was designed with a theoretical crush depth of about 100 meters, which is roughly 330 feet. Below that, the immense pressure of the ocean is supposed to warp the hull and pop the rivets.
So how deep did they go?
Tiesenhausen's boat was diving completely out of control. The needle on the surviving depth gauge dropped past the red line, sinking to an incredible 250 meters. Over 820 feet.
Good Lord.
Before the engineers finally managed to blow the ballast tanks and arrest the dive. The crew was listening to the steel hull, literally groaning and compressing around them. The fact that the pressure hull didn't instantly implode proved that the German naval architects had over-engineered the steel far beyond their own specifications.
You survive the attack, you survive the battleship trying to crush you, and then you survive the ocean itself trying to crush you. It's unrelenting.
And they kept going further. The geographical reach of these solo boats just kept expanding.
Right. Once Germany officially declared war on the United States in December 1941, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the submarine fleet, initiated Operation Drumbait. This was the start of the second happy time, right off the eastern seaboard of the U.S.
Dönitz immediately dispatched a wave of the larger long-range Type IX U-boats across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And what those commanders discovered off the coast of New York, New Jersey, and Florida was a defender that was completely, almost arrogantly, unprepared for modern naval warfare.
It is staggering to read about. The U.S. had watched the British fight the U-boats for 2 years, and yet, the source notes, the U.S. coast was fully illuminated. No blackouts at all.
None.
The neon lights of Miami and Atlantic City were blazing. That is like leaving a neon buffet open sign on for a predator.
The complacency was lethal. American merchant ships were sailing independently, completely ignoring the British lessons about convoys.
Just single ships sailing along.
Yes. They were chattering constantly on unencrypted radios, broadcasting their exact positions and manifests. And because the coastal cities refused to enforce blackouts, largely fearing it would hurt the tourism industry, the U-boat commanders had the ultimate tactical environment.
Tourism over defense? Unbelievable.
They would sit submerged offshore in the deep darkness and wait for the massive American cargo ships to pass between them and the shore. The merchantmen would be perfectly, cleanly silhouetted against the bright glow of the city lights.
It was shooting fish in a barrel. The commander of U-123, Reinhard Hartigan, sank 10 ships on his first patrol alone. The environment was so permissible that some U-boat commanders actually surfaced in broad daylight to sink ships with their deck guns.
Which, as we discussed, was immediate suicide back in the radar-swept waters of Europe.
Exactly. But eventually, the U.S. Navy wises up. They implement the interlocking convoy system, they enforce the coastal blackouts, and the easy picking vanishes. So, the U-boats are forced to push even further outward, stretching their logistics to the absolute breaking point.
This leads to the creation of the Monsoon Group.
I love this part.
The Kriegsmarine deployed massive Type IXD-2 submarines all the way down around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. They were operating out of Japanese-occupied naval bases in Malaya, specifically Penang.
Just conceptually, sailing a submarine from France to Malaysia in the 1940s is a logistical nightmare. These Type IXD-2 boats were absolute beasts. They had a theoretical range of up to 32,000 nautical miles. A single war patrol could last an agonizing 200 days.
But even with their massive fuel bunkers, they couldn't make it without support. They relied on a network of specialized supply submarines called milk-coos, or milk cows.
Oh, what are those?
These were unarmed, heavily modified Type 5C submarines that acted as underwater gas stations. The combat U-boats would secretly rendezvous with a milk cow in the desolate stretches of the South Atlantic to receive fuel, replacement torpedoes, and medical supplies.
And the detail that stood out to me in the source, these milk cows carried 440 tons of diesel fuel, but they also had specialized baking ovens installed so they could provide freshly baked bread to the exhausted combat crews.
Sounds like a luxury, right?
It does, until you realize the horrific squalor of a 200-day submarine patrol.
The physical deterioration of the crews on these long patrols is hard to overstate. A submarine is essentially a damp, cramped, foul-smelling steel tube.
Yeah, paint a picture for us.
At the beginning of a patrol, the boat was dangerously overweight. Every spare cubic inch of space, including one of the 2 tiny toilets on board, was crammed with crates of food, spare parts, and supplies. They stored glass bottles of fruit juice underneath the wooden floor decking.
No space was wasted.
But refrigeration was virtually non-existent. Fresh food rotted within weeks. Bread grew thick white mold. The internal atmosphere was a thick, suffocating blend of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, battery acid, and rotting cabbage.
Disgusting. By the time the monsoon boats finally crossed the Indian Ocean and reached Malaysia, the crews were suffering terribly from vitamin deficiencies, skin ulcers, and sheer exhaustion.
And the Japanese repair facilities at Penang were incredibly primitive compared to the concrete bunkers in France. They couldn't get the highly machined spare parts they needed, so the boats just slowly degraded.
It really paints a grim picture. So, solo hunting could yield spectacular results if you found an unprepared enemy, but it was totally unsustainable as a grand strategy.
Right. As the Allies got smarter, turned off their city lights, and concentrated their merchant ships into heavily defended, heavily escorted convoys, a single U-boat couldn't take down a herd anymore.
The math changed.
If one boat attacks a convoy of 60 ships, it might sink 2 before it is destroyed. They needed to mass their forces. They had to gang up.
The environment changed again, forcing the strategy to change. This brings us to the defining tactic of the Battle of the Atlantic, the wolf packs, or, in German, Rudeltaktik.
Yes. The shift to the wolf pack was driven by pure mathematical necessity. The Atlantic Ocean is incomprehensibly vast. Fighting a convoy in the middle of it is like searching for a specific grain of sand on a dark beach while looking through a drinking straw.
That's a great analogy.
Remember, your visual horizon from the conning tower of a low-riding U-boat is incredibly limited. So Admiral Dunitz instituted massive patrol lines designed to sweep the ocean.
Let's break down the mechanics of the Dragnet. How did you coordinate a wolf pack before satellite imagery and GPS?
They would take a group of U-boats, sometimes 5, sometimes up to 20 boats, and string them out in a massive line perpendicular to the anticipated path of an Allied convoy. The theory behind it was beautifully mathematical. They spaced the submarines at exactly twice the distance of their maximum visual range. On a clear day, a lookout standing on the conning tower with high-powered binoculars could see a ship's masts about 5 miles away. Therefore, BDU, the submarine command, ordered the boats to be spaced exactly 10 miles apart.
Oh, I see. So the 5-mile visual field of Boat A reaches out and perfectly touches the 5-mile visual field of Boat B.
Exactly.
They have created a massive, unbroken chain. A 20-boat wolf pack could cast a 200-mile-wide net across the Atlantic.
And the operational doctrine was incredibly strict. If a single U-boat in that line spotted the smoke of a convoy, it was explicitly forbidden from attacking immediately.
Wait, really? They had to hold their fire?
Yes, its job was to slip in behind the convoy, stay out of sight, and become a shadower. It would immediately transmit a high-frequency radio signal back to headquarters in France, providing the convoy's course, speed, and size.
Calling in the pack.
BDU would then transmit orders, vectoring all the other U-boats in the line to abandon their stations and converge on that specific set of coordinates.
The wolves gather around the herd. They would stalk the convoy during the day, hovering just below the horizon, and then when the sun went down, they would launch synchronized, multi-directional surface attacks.
The escorts would be completely overwhelmed trying to chase shadows in every direction. And early on, when the net held, the carnage was unimaginable.
Do you have an example?
Look at the fate of convoy SC-42 in September 1941. A single U-boat spots the convoy, which consists of 64 heavily laden freighters, but is only guarded by 4 small escort warships.
4 escorts for 64 ships? That's terrible odds.
The U-boat radios the position. Over the next 48 hours, a massive wolfpack descends on the coordinates. They absolutely slaughter the convoy. They sink roughly 20 merchant ships, destroying over 60,000 tons of desperately needed cargo.
And what were the German losses?
The German Navy doesn't lose a single submarine in the engagement. It was a tactical triumph.
But the source guide points out that there was a fatal flaw in the math. The beautiful geometry of a 10-mile space dragnet only works on a calm sea. But they're fighting in the North Atlantic in winter.
Precisely. The reality of the environment tore the theory to shreds. Maintaining a perfectly spaced line of submarines requires absolute precision in navigation.
Which they didn't have.
No. U-boat navigators, who, interestingly, were usually senior non-commissioned officers, unlike the commissioned officers in the Allied navies, relied on sextants. They had to take physical sightings of the sun or the stars to calculate their exact latitude and longitude.
And the North Atlantic is notorious for being shrouded in heavy cloud cover, fog, and monstrous rolling storms for weeks on end. If you can't see the stars, you are relying on dead reckoning. You are just guessing based on your compass and your speed.
And dead reckoning in an ocean with massive, invisible surface currents is incredibly dangerous. A U-boat might drift 5 miles of port in a storm. The boat next to it might drift 5 miles to starboard.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Suddenly, that perfect 10-mile interlocking gap is now a 20-mile blind spot. Entire Allied convoys carrying thousands of tons of supplies could and frequently did sail right through the holes in the net without a single lookout ever seeing them.
So it's a massive fishing net made of submarines, but the net keeps tearing because of the weather. But wait, I have a massive problem with the core concept of the wolf pack.
Okay, shoot.
If they absolutely had to use their high-frequency radios to call in the rest of the pack, and they are broadcasting their exact coordinates back to France, didn't any of these highly intelligent commanders suspect they were broadcasting their locations directly to the enemy?
You have hit on the fatal flaw of the entire German U-boat campaign. This raises one of the most critical elements of the war, the intelligence failure. To coordinate this massive dragnet, the U-boats and headquarters had to chatter constantly.
Right.
They felt perfectly secure doing this because every single message was encrypted using the Enigma machine.
For the listener who might not be familiar with the deep mechanics of Enigma, it wasn't just a simple substitution cipher. It was a highly complex electromechanical rotor machine.
Very complex.
When you pressed a letter on the keyboard, the electrical signal passed through a series of rotating wheels and a plug board, scrambling the letter into something else. And the machine's settings were changed every single day.
The German High Command calculated that there were billions of possible combinations. They believed with absolute, arrogant certainty that the code was mathematically unbreakable.
But it wasn't. Deep in the English countryside, at a secret facility called Bletchley Park, British mathematicians and decryption experts had achieved the impossible. Aided by the capture of German codebooks and actual Enigma machines from sinking submarines and weather ships, they cracked the naval Enigma codes.
So the British are literally reading the U-boat's mail in real time. They were receiving the coordinates for the Wolfpack patrol lines at the exact same time the U-boat commanders are.
That is just, it's mind-blowing.
Exactly. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, gave the Allies a godlike view of the chessboard. The British Admiralty would plot the German patrol lines on their massive map boards and then simply radio the merchant convoys to alter their course.
Just steer around them.
Yep. The U-boats would sit there for weeks, pitching and rolling in freezing violent storms, burning precious fuel, waiting for ships that had intentionally sailed hundreds of miles to the south.
The arrogance of believing a system is infallible cost thousands of German lives. And when the U-boats did manage to stumble upon a convoy, the Allies had developed a technological trump card that permanently neutralized the night surface attack.
Radar.
Let's talk about the physics of radar.
In the early years of the war, radar operated on long, metric wavelengths. The German U-boats carried primitive radar detectors called Menatox that could listen for those long wavelengths.
So they had a warning system.
Right. If they heard the pulse, they knew an Allied plane or ship was searching for them and they had time to dive. But in early 1943, Allied scientists perfected the cavity magnetron, which allowed them to produce shortwave centimetric radar.
Why is a shorter wavelength so devastating?
The physics of radar dictates that the shorter the wavelength, the smaller the object you can resolve. Centimetric radar could detect the tiny, exposed conning tower of a surface submarine, or even a raised periscope from miles away through pitch-black darkness or thick fog. And, crucially, it was compact enough to be mounted in the nose of an Allied patrol bomber. Furthermore, the German Menatox detectors couldn't tune in to this new super-high frequency. They were completely deaf to it.
Put yourself in the conning tower of a U-boat in May 1943. You are Otto Kretschmer's spiritual successor. You are hunting a convoy on the surface at night. You feel totally secure in the darkness. Your radar detector is silent. You think you are the invisible predator.
You feel safe.
And suddenly, without a single warning, a British B-24 Liberator bomber drops out of the sky directly overhead. It flips on a lee light, a millions of candle-power searchlight slave to the radar system. The submarine is instantly bathed in blinding, inescapable light. Before you can even scream for the crew to open the main hatch to crash dive, the plane is dropping depth charges that perfectly straddle the hull.
The hunters were slaughtered. The combination of ultra-intelligence routing the convoys away and centimetric radar hunting down any boat that did surface broke the back of the U-boat fleet.
It was a massacre.
In the single month of May 1943, during the catastrophic battles around Convoy ONS-5, the U-boat fleet lost 32 boats. Between May and July, they lost roughly 96 submarines.
That's unsustainable.
Admiral Dönitz was forced to officially withdraw the fleet from the North Atlantic. The night surface attack was dead. The Wolfpack was blind. The tactical paradigm had been permanently shattered by mathematics and radio waves.
Because finding these convoys on the vast ocean was now practically impossible for boats that were forced to spend most of their time hiding underwater. The Kriegsmarine realized they desperately needed eyes in the sky. If the submarines couldn't find the targets, airplanes had to do it for them.
Exactly.
Let's examine the Luftwaffe cooperation. Or, to be brutally accurate, the complete lack thereof.
In military theory, aerial reconnaissance is the perfect complement to submarine warfare. An aircraft traveling at 200 miles an hour can cover in a single afternoon the same amount of ocean that takes a U-boat a week to search.
And they can see so much further.
Right. From an altitude of 10,000 feet, an observer's visual horizon stretches for over 100 miles. After the fall of France in 1940, the Germans controlled air bases right on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. It should have been a flawless partnership.
It wasn't.
But the execution was severely paralyzed by internal politics and deep inter-service rivalry.
The source points the finger squarely at Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. He famously insisted that everything that flew belonged to him.
His ego was massive.
He refused to surrender control of any aircraft to the Navy. If they had established a truly integrated joint naval and air command, rather than Göring hoarding his resources to protect his own ego, could they have effectively starved Britain into submission? How much did internal bureaucracy cost the war effort?
It was a fatal structural flaw. Because there was no streamlined, integrated command, the communication chain was agonizingly slow.
How slow?
Imagine a Luftwaffe pilot spots an Allied convoy. He can't just radio the U-boats directly. He has to radio his Luftwaffe base in France. The Luftwaffe base sends the report to the Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin. Berlin reviews it, then teletypes it over to the Naval High Command. The Navy analyzes it and finally sends it down to BDU, who encrypts it and transmits it to the U-boats.
It's a massive game of telephone.
Exactly. This bureaucratic friction could easily delay the intelligence by a full 24 hours. A merchant convoy, moving at 10 knots, covers 240 nautical miles in 24 hours. By the time the U-boat commander receives the coordinates, the convoy is long gone, and he is rushing toward an empty patch of ocean.
And the tool they were using for this reconnaissance wasn't exactly a rugged, purpose-built war machine, right? They were relying heavily on the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor.
The Condor is a tragic piece of engineering. It was originally designed before the war as a sleek, civilian passenger airliner for Lufthansa.
A passenger plane.
When the war started, the Luftwaffe hastily strapped bomb racks and machine guns to it and declared it a long-range maritime patrol bomber. But its internal skeleton, its airframe, was designed for gentle commercial flights, not the violent stresses of combat.
So it wasn't sturdy enough.
If a Condor pilot found himself under fire and had to make a strenuous high-G evasive maneuver, there was a very real risk of the aircraft's wings literally ripping off the fuselage in midair.
That is horrifying.
It was also notorious for breaking its back, the fuselage snapping in half right behind the wings if the pilot made a heavy landing on a rough runway.
Despite flying an eggshell, they did have one massive, horrifying success when the communication chain actually worked. We need to talk about the tragedy of convoy PQ-17.
PQ-17 is the ultimate proof of concept. It shows what the German military could have achieved if they had coordinated properly. In July 1942, this heavily guarded convoy was sailing the brutal Arctic route from Iceland to Murmansk in Soviet Russia. It was carrying a staggering amount of hardware, enough tanks, vehicles, and ammunition to fully equip an army of 50,000 Soviet troops.
A massive prize.
A Condor on patrol spotted it. The Luftwaffe shadowed it continuously, and BDU successfully vectored 9 U-boats into an intercepting perimeter.
And the British Admiralty panicked. They intercepted intelligence that suggested a massive German surface fleet, including the legendary battleship Tirpitz, was sailing out to intercept the convoy.
Which was mostly a bluff, but it worked.
Right. The British First Sea Lord made a catastrophic decision. He ordered the escort warships to abandon the convoy to hunt the battleship, and he ordered the merchant ships to scatter.
By scattering, the merchant ships lost their greatest defense, their mutually supporting anti-aircraft fire and their tight, overlapping anti-submarine watch. They were totally alone in the ice.
It turned into a synchronized demolition of isolated targets.
It was an absolute massacre. Between the U-boats firing torpedoes from the water and the Luftwaffe Condors and Junkers bombers raining explosives from the sky, they hunted down the isolated, terrified merchantmen one by one.
So brutal.
They sank 24 out of the 36 ships. The freezing Arctic waters swallowed hundreds of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of men.
But just as they did with the Q ships and the radar, the Allies adapt to counter the threat. To stop the Condors, before the Allies had enough small escort carriers to provide proper air cover, they invented the CAM ship, catapult-armed merchantmen.
This is one of the wildest inventions of the war.
When you read about this in the source material, it sounds like one of the craziest, most desperate concepts of the entire war.
It was a weapon born of sheer desperation. The British took standard cargo ships and literally welded a massive rocket-propelled catapult ramp onto the bow.
A rocket catapult.
They placed a single Hawker Hurricane fighter plane on the rails. When a German Condor appeared on the horizon, the CAM ship would point its bow into the wind, fire the rockets, and blast the Hurricane into the sky.
But here is the terrifying reality for the listener. The Hurricane did not have pontoons to land on the water, and the merchant ship did not have a flight deck. This was a one-way ticket.
A total suicide mission if you couldn't be rescued.
Imagine being that pilot. You endure 3 Gs of force being rocketed off a cargo ship. You engage the heavy German bomber, hopefully shooting it down or chasing it away. But once your fuel runs low, you look down at the freezing, gray Atlantic rollers.
And you have to pitch.
You have 2 options. Ditch the plane into the ocean and pray it doesn't flip and trap you, or roll the canopy back, bail out with a parachute, and hit the freezing water, praying that a convoy escort ship stops to fish you out before hypothermia stops your heart.
It required unfathomable bravery. But it worked. The threat of a hurricane suddenly appearing in the middle of the ocean forced the fragile Condors to keep their distance, and eventually the CAM ships were replaced by small escort aircraft carriers that completely sealed the airspace above the convoys.
So let's summarize the nightmare the U-boat crews are facing by late 1943. The Luftwaffe is grounded or shot down. Their Enigma codes are being read like a daily newspaper. And Allied centimetric radar is hunting them night and day, making it impossible to surface.
They're completely trapped.
They are losing submarines at a totally unsustainable rate. They are backed into a corner. This forces the German Navy into a frantic, desperate, technological arms race to try and invent their way out of a tactical dead end.
This is a classic historical symptom. When a military force permanently loses the strategic initiative, you see the sudden introduction of highly complex, often fatally flawed technological gimmicks. They were trying to apply mechanical band-aids to a fundamentally broken paradigm. The U-boat had permanently lost the element of invisibility.
Let's start by looking at their offensive tech. Since the Allied escort ships were now highly maneuverable and skilled at dodging standard straight-running torpedoes, the Germans completely reimagined the weapon. They developed the FAT and LUT torpedoes.
Pattern-running torpedoes.
Yes. You fire them, they run straight for a predetermined distance, and then the internal gyroscopes take over, forcing the torpedo to make continuous 90-degree and 180-degree turns, meandering back and forth across the ocean.
The logic was sound for convoy warfare. If a submarine fires a straight torpedo into a massive column of merchant ships and it misses its primary target, it just sails harmlessly out the other side into open water.
Wasted.
The FAT torpedo was designed to stay inside the convoy box. If it missed the first ship, it would do a switchback, turn around, and sweep through the columns again and again until it eventually slammed into something.
But even more advanced than the pattern runners were the acoustic homing torpedoes, the T4 Falk and the much more famous T5 Zonkönig. These weren't dumb weapons, they were designed to listen.
Yes, the T5 was an incredible piece of acoustic engineering for its time. It had 2 hydrophone receivers mounted in the nose. It was specifically tuned to listen for the cavitation noise of a ship's propeller.
We should explain cavitation for the listener because it's a fascinating physical phenomenon.
Good idea.
When a ship's propeller spins very fast, it creates areas of incredibly low pressure in the water behind the blades. This low pressure literally boils the water, creating thousands of tiny vacuum bubbles. When those bubbles collapse, they pop with immense acoustic energy. It is incredibly loud underwater.
Precisely. The T5 torpedo was designed to zero in on the specific high-frequency cavitation noise created by the fast-spinning propellers of Allied escort destroyers.
Seeking the loudest thing in the water.
The tactical doctrine was to fire the T5 at the escorts, shoot the sheepdog, so that the U-boat could then leisurely slaughter the defenseless merchant sheep. And it had some terrifying initial success in late 1943. But there was a horrific, fatal flaw in the design.
What was it?
The acoustic sensors were far too sensitive.
The torpedo couldn't tell the difference between the enemy and its own submarine?
Exactly. When a U-boat fired a T5, it was heavily suspected that the torpedo would immediately lock onto the loudest cavitation noise in the area, which was often the propeller of the U-boat that had just fired it.
Oh, man.
It's strongly believed by naval historians that at least 2 German submarines, U-377 and U-972, fired acoustic torpedoes that immediately pulled a 180-degree turn, locked onto the U-boat's engines, and blew the submarines to pieces.
Blown up by their own weapon.
To prevent this agonizing friendly fire, BDU issued frantic orders. The second a commander fired a T5, he had to order a crash dive to 60 meters to get below the torpedo's acoustic search cone or completely kill the engines and drift in absolute silence until they heard the explosion.
And the tragic irony is that the Allies figured out the acoustic torpedo and countered it almost instantly anyway. They deployed a countermeasure called a Foxer.
The Foxer was brutally simple and completely effective. It was an array of hollow, perforated steel tubes that the Allied warships towed on a long cable a few hundred meters behind the ship.
Just dragging metal pipes.
As the ship moved, the water rushing violently through and around these tubes made a horrific, screeching mechanical noise that was exponentially louder than the ship's actual propellers. The highly sophisticated German acoustic torpedoes would lock onto the primitive metal tubes, chase them, and harmlessly explode in the wake hundreds of yards behind the surviving ship.
So the high-tech torpedoes are getting distracted by noisy metal pipes. But what about the U-boat's sensory deprivation? Since they can't stay on the surface because of radar, and they don't have the condors to scout for them anymore, how do they find the enemy?
This leads to one of the most unbelievable inventions in the book. The Bigstelz, or the wagtail.
The wagtail was a desperate attempt to artificially increase the submarine's visual horizon. It was a literal, unpowered gyrocopter. Think of a rotary-winged kite built out of lightweight metal tubing with a small, terrifyingly exposed seat for a single observer.
Wait, I need the listener to truly picture this. They are flying a human kite, attached to a submarine in the middle of the freezing ocean.
That is exactly what it was. The crew would assemble this contraption on the back deck of the submarine. A young sailor would be strapped into the seat. The U-boat would then motor forward directly into the wind.
Like flying a kite on the beach.
The rushing air would spin the overhead rotors, generating aerodynamic lift, and the crew would slowly spool out a heavy steel cable from a winch mounted on the conning tower.
They are towing a human being into the sky.
They could winch the observer up to about 400 feet in the air. From that altitude, the visual horizon increases from 5 miles to 25 miles. The sailor has a pair of binoculars and a telephone wire running down the tether to talk to the captain.
Okay.
But think about the horrific job description here. You are 400 feet in the air, dangling from a submarine. You look through your binoculars and spot an Allied patrol bomber dropping out of the clouds, heading straight for you.
You'd scream into the phone.
But as we discussed, the submarine needs 30 seconds to crash dive. The bomber will be there in 15 seconds. The submarine commander cannot wait to slowly winch you back down.
So what do?
The official standing order from BDU was to cut the cable.
The submarine crew would grab an axe or wire cutters, sever the tether, and instantly seal the hatch and dive.
That is pure nightmare fuel. The observer in the sky was supposed to pull a lever to jettison the heavy metal rotors, deploy a parachute, and splash into the ocean. He just had to tread water and pray the U-boat survived the depth charge attack and eventually surfaced hours later to find him.
Unbelievable. Did this Rube Goldberg machine actually achieve anything?
Statistically, almost nothing. We only know of one confirmed successful interception using it when U-177 used the wagtail to spot and sink a Greek freighter in the Indian Ocean in 1943. Most U-boat commanders absolutely hated it. They thought it was far too dangerous and time-consuming to assemble on deck, especially when an Allied plane could appear on radar at any second.
And the frantic, desperate ideas just kept coming. We have to touch on the Biber midget submarines. The plan in early 1945 was to literally strap tiny one-man midget submarines onto the external deck of a massive Type 7 U-boat, sail all the way up to the icy waters of Soviet Russia, release the midget subs, and have them sneak into a shallow harbor to torpedo a Soviet battleship.
Sound like a bad movie plot.
It was an operational failure before we even engaged the enemy. The designers ignored the fundamental laws of physics. Midget submarines were designed exclusively for shallow coastal waters. Their hulls were thin.
Okay, so they can't go deep.
But the mother submarine carrying them had to dive deep into the ocean to avoid Allied air patrols during the transit. The immense water pressure at those transit depths completely crushed the fragile midget subs while they were still strapped to the deck.
Oh, wow.
The pressure fractured their hulls, flooded their batteries, and crushed their external torpedoes. The mission was completely aborted because the weapons destroyed themselves.
And finally, they tried to invent their way out of the radar problem with defensive tech, deploying decoys like Aphrodite and Thetis.
Yes, these were early primitive attempts at electronic warfare. Aphrodite was a large hydrogen balloon tethered to a floating raft. The balloon trailed long, metallic strips of aluminum foil, what we now call chaff.
To fool the radar.
These metal strips were highly reflective to Allied radar pulses. A U-boat being hunted at night would launch the balloon, let it float there looking exactly like a massive submarine on a radar screen, and then the real U-boat would silently slip away onto the surface while the Allied destroyers raced toward the balloon. Thetis was a similar concept, a wooden buoy covered in radar-reflecting steel poles.
But again, these are mechanical band-aids on a mortal wound. The sheer, overwhelming volume of Allied ships, aircraft, and overlapping radar coverage by 1944 meant that a decoy only bought you a few minutes of time. If a destroyer figured out it was a balloon, there were 3 more destroyers 5 miles away, ready to pick up the real trail. The ocean had shrunk.
The environment had completely adapted to the predator, rendering it almost extinct.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We have watched the U-boat war morph entirely. It started with the surgical, calculated, almost gentlemanly strikes of silent auto, checking papers and utilizing a massive speed advantage.
Right.
Then it evolved into the massive, terrifying, mathematically rigid dragnets of the wolf packs. And finally, under the crushing weight of Allied radar and code breaking, it ended in this frantic, doomed scramble of desperate technologies, torpedoes that homed in on their own engines, human kites abandoned to the ocean, and crushed submarines strapped to the decks of bigger submarines.
And for you listening, this historical deep dive provides a profound lesson in the brutality of adaptation. No matter how perfect, How invincible your strategy seems in the moment like the night surface attack in 1940, the environment will inevitably adapt to counter you.
It always does.
It proves that tactical brilliance on the front lines cannot save you if your foundational systems are flawed. The German commanders fought with incredible ingenuity, but because they didn't realize their unbreakable enigma, communications were compromised, and because their internal factions like the Navy and the Luftwaffe refused to share resources, they were doomed. A flawed foundation will eventually collapse the entire structure.
It is a brutal, unforgiving equation. We learned today that 75% of U-boat commanders sailed out and never hit a single ship. By the very end of the war, the chilling statistics showed that a submarine crew's life expectancy was an average of just 1.5 patrols.
Just 1.5 patrols.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as we close. Think about the sheer, unimaginable psychological weight that reality places on a human being. How do you maintain military discipline? How do you force yourself to meticulously maintain highly complex, dangerous machinery? How do you hold on to any shred of morale or humanity when every single man trapped inside that damp, freezing, foul-smelling steel tube knows that, mathematically speaking, they are already ghosts? It's a haunting reality, and it's something to think about the next time you look out at the cold, dark ocean.